Fellas, there are some up-and-coming fights that have been officially announced by the UFC that just don't really make sense. Fights that could have had much better alternatives or much better options. So I'm going to be taking a look at a few examples of UFC fights that are up-and-coming on some cards that no one wants to see them, and what it should be instead. So the better alternative that most MMA fans would probably prefer, and why these fights don't make sense. So we've got a couple examples on this list. Let me know if I've missed any out, but we'll go in there with the first example. The first example of a fight that nobody wants to see is Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque. Now, technically, this doesn't actually have an official date, but the UFC have said they're going to reschedule this fight, which probably means it's going to be happening either later this year or maybe early next year. And obviously, it was originally supposed to be on UFC Abu Dhabi. But I don't really understand what the point is in Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque, because if you've got a legend like Nick Diaz in the UFC, he's looked terrible against Robbie Lawler in his last fight. You'd expect to see him against maybe another legend or somebody who's not elite, well, not that elite. And I understand Vicente Luque is not in the best stage in his career. He hasn't really been performing in his past couple of fights, but it's still night and day between the two of them. Vicente Luque is going to scramble Nick Diaz like an egg. You've got a legend in Nick Diaz who looked horrible when he fought Robbie Lawler. That was 3 years ago as well. Why are we giving him a ranked fighter? Why are we giving him Vicente Luque, who still has the capability to be very dangerous in his fights? This is going to be rescheduled, and I don't think it makes any sense. And I think the obvious alternative that most MMA fans want to see is Nick Diaz versus Tony Ferguson. I think this should be made for the UFC 309 card, which is probably going to be Jones versus Miocic. I mean, it's on a big card. Everyone's going to be watching. If you have this as like the main card opener, this is going to be a great fight. Listen, nobody's expecting this to be a high-level fight. It's going to be like watching two old people fight out of a care home, but it's a much better fight than Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque, because first reason, at least one of them get to win. At least we ever get to see Tony Ferguson break his losing streak, or we get to see Nick Diaz go out there and get a win after years and years of not fighting. Well, not years of not fighting, but years of not winning. So I think Nick Diaz versus Ferguson makes the most sense. They're not going to take insane amount of damage either. You've got Diaz against Luque, where he's probably going to get absolutely battered. He's not going to get battered by Tony Ferguson. Neither of these guys are going to take much damage. You can have a double retirement as well, a double retirement on the card. Ferguson technically half retired, and I still think he's got one fight left in him. If you put him against Nick Diaz, both of these guys are probably going to retire on this card. Nick Diaz, Tony Ferguson. It's just the fact that makes a lot of sense. Two legends going at it, two guys that desperately need to retire, two guys that don't have anything left to offer. Diaz, Ferguson should have been the fight to make. I still don't understand why Nick Diaz is against Vicente Luque. The chances of Nick Diaz even coming close to beating Vicente Luque is extremely slim. Put him against Tony Ferguson. Two guys that need to win, two guys that need to retire, two legends. Put it on a big card like 309. It's the easiest matchmaking ever. And I know there's been a few people saying that Nick Diaz is too big for Tony Ferguson. They were both scheduled to fight in the welterweight division. Ferguson fought at 170 in his last fight. Nick Diaz was scheduled to be facing Luque at 170. They're both able to make 170. So that's how Ferguson versus Nick Diaz, UFC 309. It's the obvious alternative, and I think most MMA fans would prefer this to Nick Diaz versus Vicente Luque. So that's the first fight, in my opinion, that doesn't really make any sense. The next fight has been recently announced, and it is Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree. This has been announced as the main event for UFC 307. Now, listen, I would have preferred... I'm not going to complain too much about this matchup in terms of the 307 card, because a million times I would pick this over Pennington versus Juliana Pena as the main event. But out of all the light heavyweight fights you could have made, Alex Pereira versus Khalil Rountree doesn't make any sense, because Khalil Rountree, he's not even the number 1 or number 2 or even the number 3 contender in this division. He's like back of the queue. I don't understand why Khalil Rountree, of all people, have got a title shot. He's best when he's Anthony Smith. He hasn't even beaten like a Jan Blachowicz or a Yuri or a Hill or even somebody like an Alexander Rakic. He's best when he's Anthony Smith, and he got a robbery one of a Dustin Jacoby, and he just got, I swear, he just got put for PEDs or got put for some like illegal substance, which is why he had to get pulled out against a fight with Jamal Hill. This fight makes no sense, and nobody saw it coming. Now listen, I'm not saying that Khalil Rountree has zero chance, even though most people, including myself, are going to be sadding with Pereira by finish for this fight. Rountree is a pretty good Thai boxer, but that's not the point. The point is he hasn't built himself up in the light heavyweight division. He hasn't earned a title shot. He's like the back of the queue. You've got guys like Tom Aspinall, who hasn't got a title shot, and then you've got guys like Khalil Rountree, who have somehow been able to finesse themselves a title shot. What the fight should have been is Alex Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev. I'm sure Ankalaev would have taken this fight. I know we said he wanted to fight in Abu Dhabi, but if he's getting a title fight, I'm sure he would have taken it anyway. Pereira versus Magomed Ankalaev, I mean, it's the fight everyone wants to see. Ankalaev's actually earned his title shot. He also beat Anthony Smith, and he went out there in his last fight and knocked out Johnny Walker, and I think he should have beaten Jan Blachowicz when they fought. I think he's the most difficult dude for Alex Pereira in this division. There's a lot of questions to be answered in this fight. How does Pereira do when he faces a guy with a decent level of grappling and a guy that's got dangerous hands in Ankalaev? It's by far Pereira's biggest test in the light heavyweight division. By far one of the most intriguing fights in the UFC. This was the obvious pick to make. You know, they've been going at each other on Twitter. Pereira and Ankalaev should have been next for the light heavyweight belt. And even though I'm not a massive... Listen, I've got nothing against Khalil Roundtree. He hasn't earned the title shot. It should have been Pereira and Ankalaev. And if they couldn't have made it for UFC 307, fuck it. Just have Pantoja as the main event. Move this to a different card. Because I would rather have this than Pereira versus Khalil Roundtree, and I think everyone would as well. So that's another example of a fight that doesn't really make any sense and nobody cares about. The next example is also going to be on this same card of UFC 307, and it's Jose Aldo versus Mario Bautista. Why are we giving Jose Aldo another up-and-comer? Why? He's just faced an up-and-comer in Jonathan Martinez at UFC 301, which was bad matchmaking anyway, and he beat him comfortably. Why are we giving him another up-and-comer? Why is he fighting down the rankings when, first of all, he's coming off a win, and he's beaten so many people already in the bantamweight division? It doesn't make sense when you've got a legend like Jose Aldo coming back to give him, first of all, Jonathan Martinez, but then to give him Mario Bautista as well. And listen, I've got nothing against Mario Bautista. I think he's one of the dark horses of the bantamweight division, but that doesn't mean I want to see him against Jose Aldo. The fight that should have been made is Jose Aldo versus Henry Cejudo, or maybe somebody like Song Yudong. But I think Cejudo versus Aldo was the fight to make. Two former champions, two of some of the greatest in the UFC, two legends, and I think it makes a lot of sense. If Aldo can go out there and beat Henry Cejudo, he puts himself straight back into title contention by fighting somebody that's ranked above him. Cejudo's on a 2-fight losing streak. He needs to be put away from the title area. Let him face another legend in Jose Aldo, a fight that would excite him, a Legends fight, a fight that has actually been scheduled before. I think Aldo versus Cejudo makes a lot more sense than a guy like Aldo versus Mario Bautista. It doesn't really make sense why the UFC keep trying to make prospects, or make a name out of these prospects by using Jose Aldo as kind of like the, you know, the guy to make a name out of. It should have been Aldo versus Cejudo, the fight that everyone wants to see, the fight that makes a lot more sense, and especially after Aldo's last fight, you know, he looked a lot more different compared to what he did usually. Aldo, Cejudo should have been for UFC 307, and I think everyone would pick this fight over Aldo versus Mario Bautista. The next example is one of the more obvious ones in the UFC, Jon Jones versus Stipe Miocic. This is the definition of two guys that would have made a fight, well, two guys that would have made sense fighting each other a couple of years ago, but no longer. Dana's trying to hype this up as if it's the best versus the best. It's not. It's the greatest of all time versus the greatest heavyweight of all time. Not the best versus the best. No one wants to see this fight. Stipe, he hasn't fought since 2021 when he got knocked out brutally by Francis Ngannou. And since then, he's been completely inactive. He's been limping into arenas. He's not fit to fight. And if he is, he doesn't deserve a title shot anyway. And for Jon Jones, the dude's had one win in the heavyweight division against Cyril Gane. He should have been facing Sergey Pavlovich when Sergey was on his come up and he didn't. He should have been facing Tom Aspinall and he's refusing. Nobody wants to see Jones versus Miocic. We're not in the year 2020 anymore. It's not the fight to make. If they are going to do this fight, why is it for the heavyweight belt? Because neither of these guys are the best in the division. We all know who the best in the division is, and it's Tom Aspinall, which is why the fight to be made should have been Jon Jones versus Tom Aspinall. Again, I'm not going to go into detail why this needs to be made. Everyone knows it already. Aspinall is the interim champion. He's literally had to defend his interim champion. I think he's beaten 6 top 10 ranked heavyweights in the first round, which is crazy because in any other division, you would be the champion or at least be fighting for a belt if that was, you know, what you had on your stats. He's the best heavyweight in the world, is Tom Aspinall. He's quicker than everyone. He's better than everyone. He keeps beating the other #1 contenders. He beat Blades. He beat Pavlovich. He beat Volkov. He's beating everyone in the division as Aspinall. He's next in line. This is the best versus the best. The heavyweight champion versus the interim champion. The so-called best in Jon Jones versus the actual best in Tom Aspinall. The legend versus the guy on his come-up. This is the fight that everyone wants to see. I haven't seen anyone say that they want to see Jones versus Miocic over Jones versus Aspinall. Even Jon Jones fans. Even if you're a Jon Jones fan, surely you'd prefer to see Jones versus Aspinall. This should be the main event on UFC 309, what will by far be the biggest pay-per-view of the year. People keep saying that Stipe is a bigger star and a bigger pay-per-view star than Tom Aspinall, and maybe that's true. But if you're an MMA fan, it doesn't make sense why anyone would rather see Jones versus Stipe over Jones versus Tom Aspinall. You've got a guy who's basically demolishing everyone in the heavyweight division against a guy that's never lost before. There's so many narratives going into this fight. It makes all the sense. They've even been going back and forth on Twitter now. Aspinall's been posting skits promoting a fight that he's never going to get. So Jones versus Aspinall, it is the fight that makes the more sense in the heavyweight division. It's the fight that we want to see. And I think it's ridiculous how Dana White's still trying to bring in Stipe. And I don't know why Dana White wants that fight so badly when there's an obvious massive fight here in Jones versus Aspinall. So that's another example of a fight that nobody wants to see. The next example is also on that UFC 307 card, and it is Pennington versus Juliana Pena. First reason why is Juliana Pena getting a title shot. Okay, well done. You beat Amanda Nunes, one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. Congratulations, because you got absolutely splattered in the next fight that you had, okay? She got splattered in the rematch. Since then, she literally hasn't fought at all. Why is she getting an immediate title shot against Pennington? I mean, first of all, no one, please just don't let them be at the press conference, because if we have to listen to Pena and Pennington go at it at the press conference, it's going to make my ears bleed. It's going to make me turn off the press conference. Nobody wants to see these guys go at the press conference. They're two of the most irritating people in the division. Neither of these guys are really in fun fights apart from Pena's fight with Nunes. No one wants to see Pennington versus Juliana Pena. Instead, we want to see Pennington versus Kayla Harrison. Kayla Harrison is one of my favourite female MMA fighters because she just looks so much better than everyone in the division. She came in the UFC, absolutely dominated Holly Holm, made it look completely easy. She's so strong. She's this judo athlete, and I truly believe that Kayla Harrison will be the champion of the world because she's so big. Like, she's so big for the division as well. She's massive as Kayla Harrison. I still can't believe she made weight when she fought Holly Holm. Pennington versus Kayla Harrison, especially after Kayla Harrison's win at UFC 300, makes the more sense. And I think Kayla Harrison would go out there and absolutely splatter Pennington for the belt. I think this is the fight that most MMA fans wants to see. I know Harrison's got a #1 contender fight up and coming, but just give her an immediate title shot. Why is Juliana Pena getting the shot over Kayla Harrison? It makes no sense. Because who asked for Pennington versus Pena? So that's another example I got on this list. And the final example is Jeff Neal versus Rafael dos Anjos. This is on UFC 308, which is one of the most stacked cards this year. And I'm not a massive hater of this matchup, but I don't think it's going to be terrible. But I just don't understand what Rafael dos Anjos is trying to do in his career. It seems like every other fight he's changing weight classes. He will fight at lightweight, then it will go back to welterweight, then it will go back to lightweight, and now he's at welterweight again. I don't know what he's trying to do. I just don't understand what he's trying to achieve because he's facing these tough opponents in different divisions. I just don't know what he's trying to get at, unless he's just trying to get a paycheck. I don't understand how Jeff Neal versus Rafael dos Anjos makes any sense. I mean, first reason, I don't understand how Rafael dos Anjos has earned a fight against Jeff Neal. I don't know Jeff Neal's... Okay, Jeff Neal's ranked number 10 in the division. Rafael dos Anjos is like number 15th or 14th in the lightweight division. How, when he's coming off 2 losses, he's managed to get a fight against number 10th ranked Jeff Neal? I don't understand that at all. So I don't understand how he's earned that matchup. And it just doesn't really make any sense. Rafael dos Anjos versus Jeff Neal. It's a bit of a random matchup. I'm pretty sure Jeff Neal is going to go out there and absolutely batter Rafael dos Anjos as well because his performances recently haven't been that good. So I think the fight that should have been made is Jeff Neal versus MVP. Both of these guys have lost to Ian Gary, and I think this would be super interesting for a striking matchup in the UFC. You've got MVP, who's considered one of the best strikers in the welterweight division. Jeff Neal, definitely one of the best boxers in the division. It would be a striking test for MVP. I think this would be an absolute banger and such a fun clash of styles on the feet in the welterweight division. I think it makes a lot of sense right now in both of their careers. And it makes a lot more sense than Jeff Neal versus Rafael dos Anjos. If this was on UFC 308, this would by far make the card even more stacked than what it already is. So MVP versus Jeff Neal, in my opinion, was always the fight that made a lot more sense than Jeff Neal versus Rafael dos Anjos. But that is some examples of up-and-coming fights in the UFC that I just don't think make any sense. Fights that no one really wants to see. And they're alternative to what it should be. So let me know your thoughts on these matchups and the alternatives. And thank you for watching.